Module 5 is going to cover concepts from Chapter 6 in your textbook, which is about kind of an introduction to the concept of cell metabolism. And really, the most important thing that this chapter does is um, kind of set us up for success for our next module, which is going to talk about cellular respiration. So, this module 5 and module 6 are very, very much linked. And so understanding concepts here is going to help a lot once we get into module 6, which historically students have had some trouble with. So try to focus on some of these concepts and look for connections between what we learn here and what we learn next week. In order to talk about metabolism, we need to talk about energy, and specifically energy for living things all comes from, originally, the sun. The sun provides energy in the form of heat and also in the form of light. Plants are able to take that light and heat energy and transform it into a type of energy that animals and decomposers like fungi, bacteria, worms can use. That energy from the plants is then taken in by these consumers and decomposers and transformed in a way that their cells can use it. And then eventually that energy gets released from these animals or from these decomposers as heat. This is why, if you've ever been near like a compost pile, or you've just had left like some grass out or some like plants that are breaking down out in the sun, it's going to give off some heat. That's the energy being released by all of these decomposers breaking down those once living things. On the last slide, I mentioned energy, but in a couple different forms. And so on this slide, let's talk about the different types of energy, how they're different, and put them in with a kind of an analogy that helps make sense of things. So in general, energy is the capacity to produce change, or the energy, or the capacity to do work. It's what things use in order to do something. One type of energy is kinetic energy, and this is the energy of movement. A certain type of kinetic energy is thermal energy, or heat. That would be considered kinetic energy because it's generated by the movement of molecules. Now, kind of on the other end of the spectrum of kinetic energy is potential energy. This is energy that is stored and can be used later. Chemical energy, which is stored in chemical bonds, is a type of potential energy. So if we think about this from perspective of someone diving in the pool or into a lake, right? Someone standing on the diving board has lots of potential energy. They are not moving, so there's no kinetic energy, but they are high up, and when they jump off the diving board, they will release lots of kinetic energy. So they have the potential to release lots of energy. When we dive into the lake, that diving is converting that potential energy into kinetic energy until we hit the water, at which point our potential energy has now dropped. Once we're in the water, we can no longer, we don't have that same potential to like dive and fall. So as a result, someone in the water has a lower potential energy than someone who is on the platform. When we climb back up the ladder to get back to the diving board, we're then converting that kinetic energy. We are moving to get to the top of this diving board to a place of higher potential energy. So we are transforming kinetic energy into potential energy. So you see how the cycle kind of works. Lots of potential energy. It gets used up, kind of like kinetic energy. We get brought to a state of lower potential energy, and then we need to do some work to transform kinetic energy into more potential energy. When talking about energy in a biological context, it is really, really, really important we understand our laws of thermodynamics. And I introduced these a little bit way back in Module 1, but now we really need to understand them. So 2 laws here. First law, energy cannot be created or destroyed. What that means is energy, there's no new energy that gets made, and when energy gets used, it doesn't get lost. Instead, energy just gets transformed. Right? Chemical energy, food that we eat that has chemical energy in it, we use that energy to move our bodies around. Chemical energy just gets transformed into kinetic energy. Light energy from the sun is transformed into chemical energy by plants via photosynthesis. Law number 2. And law number 2, I think, is the more important one, or the one that sort of at least for me, kind of links lots of what we're going to talk about in this module and the next. So it's really important to understand this concept. It's one of those things like how electronegativity kind of linked together and polarity kind of linked together lots of stuff on exam 1. Second law of thermodynamics links together lots of stuff for exam 2. So when there is an energy transformation, like we just talked about, energy transformation, when that occurs spontaneously, there's going to be an increase in entropy. Entropy is disorder. So more entropy means more disorder, or in other words, how spread out that energy is. Another way of thinking about this is that the second law of thermodynamics states that energy wants to move toward a more disordered state. If you want to take some large thing and break it into smaller things, that will occur spontaneously. If we want to take lots of smaller things and build them up together into one larger thing, that will not occur spontaneously because we are reducing entropy. This is why just sort of like being alive burns calories, right? Just the processes that our cells go through to keep our body from falling apart requires a certain amount of energy, because without that input of energy, our bodies would kind of just fall apart, because all of these molecules, all of this energy that's holding us together wants to decay and spread out. It doesn't want to stay all bound up in our little human form. So systems want to or will spontaneously move toward a state of more disorder. Whenever a chemical reaction occurs, there is a change in both the potential energy and the entropy of the system. This makes sense, right? Because a chemical reaction is making or breaking a chemical bond. And so if we make a chemical bond, we're connecting two smaller things, then we are increasing our potential energy, and that decreases entropy. If we break a chemical bond, we take one larger thing, break it into two smaller things, that makes more disorder, more entropy, but decreases our potential energy. So the potential energy, or the energy that can be used to do work, is called Gibbs free energy. And if we want to, don't get too hung up on this equation. This is more just to kind of like highlight the point. If we want to understand how that Gibbs free energy changes, then we need to consider the change in H, or enthalpy. You can just think of this as the energy stored in chemical bonds, minus the temperature and the change in entropy. So in other words, if we consider the products of a chemical reaction, and we see that the change from the products, from the reactants to the products made more energy in chemical bonds. In other words, this number is positive and this is a high number. And this number over here, this change in entropy, is a low number. Then we'll have a positive change in free energy. If instead we break chemical bonds, then this change will be a small number or a negative number. And then this number will be really large. We'll have become more, will increase the entropy. It'll become more disordered. So when we're breaking chemical bonds, this value is larger than this value, and we end up with a negative delta G, or negative change in free energy. When we have a reaction with a negative delta G, or negative change in free energy, that means that our reactants had more potential energy, more free energy, than our products. This is called an exergonic reaction. The products have less potential energy than the reactants. As a result, because energy is not created or destroyed, that energy that was once in the reactants and is not in the products is released. These sort of reactions happen spontaneously because we are moving toward an increase in entropy, more disorder. Okay, because there is less or fewer chemical bonds over here. We've taken a larger thing, broken it into smaller things. So more disorder, less potential energy. The energy is released and can be used for other things. In an endergonic reaction, we have the exact opposite. The reactants have lower potential energy than the products, and so delta G is positive. And these sort of reactions are not going to release energy, but instead will require an input of energy. These reactions do not happen spontaneously, but they are very important because they are how our cells are going to store energy. So now we have these products that we made with more potential energy than we had before. So then these products can be used as reactants for an exergonic reaction when we want to break them down again to release energy when we need it. And so we end up with this kind of cycle of exergonic and endergonic reactions that are fueling each other. When an exergonic reaction happens, we have high energy reactants. They get turned into lower energy products, and that energy gets released. That energy that is released is used to take low energy reactants and transform them into higher potential energy products. Then these higher potential energy products can be used in an exergonic reaction. Lower energy products, energy is released, and we continue the cycle on and on and on, where all of these exergonic reactions are fueling the endergonic reactions, and then the energy we're storing with the endergonic reactions is used in the form of an exergonic reaction. And typically, when we talk about energy in exergonic and endergonic reactions, what we're talking about is transferring either an electron or a phosphate group. We'll talk about using electrons as a way to transfer energy in the next module. For now, we're going to focus on the transfer of that phosphate group to transfer energy. And cells will mainly do this with a molecule called ATP. ATP is a nucleotide. It contains a sugar, an nitrogenous base, specifically adenine. That's why we get this A. And then it has a chain of 3 phosphate groups. the T is tri for 3, and P is for phosphate. So adenosine triphosphate, and that's what you're seeing here, right? Here's our sugar. It is a ribose sugar. So this is RNA. This would be an RNA nucleotide. And then we have our adenine nitrogenous base, the double ring. And then we have 3 phosphate groups. Now, something you'll notice about these phosphate groups is they all have a negative charge. And yet, they are all bound together and therefore stuck really close to each other. These negative charges don't like to be stuck really close to each other. So, when one of these bonds breaks between the phosphate group, lots and lots of energy gets released. It's sort of like, right, holding those negative charges together is sort of like pulling a rubber band back really, really far. The farther you pull it back, the harder it is to hold, and the further it will fling when you let it go. Same idea here, because we're holding these charges together that don't want to be held together. When they are able to separate, they will do so in a way that generates lots of energy. So that's what we say. That's what we mean when we say these are high energy bonds. It's because they're bonds that don't really want to stick together. So when they're able to separate, they do so dramatically. That releases lots of energy. Here is kind of that process I was just talking about of using the transfer of one of these phosphate groups to make an endergonic reaction happen. And so, like, maybe this graph is more confusing than it is clarifying. But if you're kind of not getting it, this really spells out how ATP is used as a source of energy for the cell using what we just learned about exergonic and endergonic reactions. So let's take an endergonic reaction where we have A and B and we want to bind them together into one molecule over here. I can't 100% tell because my recorded face is covering it, but somewhere over here there is A and B bound together. Okay. Normally, that's gonna be endergonic because A and B separated are right. A and B separated have lower potential energy than A and B together. So if we want to decrease that entropy, then we're going to need an input of energy. If this reaction instead happens with ATP, like we see up here, well, now we're already starting with a much higher potential energy reactant, higher than the ultimate product. So when this ATP loses one of its phosphates, it goes from being ATP to ADP, adenosine diphosphate. We go from 3 phosphates, tri, to 2 diphosphate. This is a process called ATP hydrolysis. So when ATP hydrolysis occurs, we get a free phosphate group, right? That phosphate is going to break off, and it'll bind itself to one of these reactants. As a result, we have higher potential energy reactants than we normally would, like we had down here. And so this reaction of connecting A to B is now spontaneous because we're going from higher potential energy to lower potential energy. So by adding a chemical bond, specifically the phosphate bond from the ATP, we increase the potential energy of the reactants, and that allows our reaction to happen spontaneously.